Well, yes, it's quite a story now because in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the vast majority of the new infections have been coming from foreign worker or migrant worker dormitories. Now, these are massive housing complexes where migrant workers, almost all men from the neighboring countries, are housed in barrack-like conditions, like 12 men to a room, 20 men to a room, in bunk beds with shared bathrooms and shared toilets, very cramped, very little space for each man. And that's where the infections are mostly coming from now.
So presumably it is difficult for them to keep the required distance apart. Are they able to practice any of the other measures recommended by the government to keep COVID-19 at bay?
Well, that's the real difficulty right now. And I think a lot of the instructions or advice from the government may be somewhat misguided because there's a lot of stress about social distancing and how they must stay apart from each other during meal times or when they do the exercise in the yard. But they also require that the men must stay like 20 or 22 hours in a day in the room, and they are only allowed out for specific periods to get their meals or to get some exercise. However, so while it may be possible to enforce some kind of social distancing when they are downstairs or in the yard, what happens to the 22 hours where they are stuck in a room with 15 or 20 other men? So a lot of that rhetoric about social distancing doesn't take into account the real circumstances and the actual living conditions of migrant workers. This is a big, big blind side to Singapore right now.
Well, the workers themselves had been kind of warning about the risk that they themselves face. Have they been able to access the medical help and psychological support that they need?
Well, actually, it's our organization, Transient Workers Council, that first raised the alarm last month that, the dormitories are a ripe breeding ground for the infection. And we had suggested certain preparatory moves, but only now are they being carried out rather late. And so the result is that the workers are now being locked down in the dormitories and they are bored, stiff. They complain that the food is no good. They have nothing to do. They don't get the kind of fresh air that they want, and they depend on the phone or Wi-Fi for connection and communication with the families and with the outside world. The broadband is just simply not enough. The bandwidth is not enough. And if they fall sick, of course, yeah, that ambulance will come and get them, and they'll get the necessary treatment. But that's only if you fall sick in a big way. So we have other workers who have aches and pains and or have a previous work injury and therefore need a continuing prescription to help them recover from the work injury. And they are telling us, we can't get out of the dorm, we can't visit the clinic, we can't get our prescriptions topped up. So my painkillers are running out. So what am I going to do when that happens? And it's a scramble every day trying to give help to them.
A really difficult situation. I understand cruise ships are being considered as alternatives to these dormitories. Do you believe this would be a better solution than having them stay where they are now?
I'm not sure I got your question, but I think you said something about cruise ships being used as alternative dormitories. As far as we know, only 2 barges housing, I think, about 1,000 workers at most have been deployed for this purpose. But it's interesting you mentioned cruise ships because, as we all know, from the very beginning of the epidemic, there was a cruise ship in Yokohama, Japan, which began with just a few cases on board, and then they quarantined the entire cruise ship so that the sick and the well all had to stay together, even though they were confined to their staterooms. And then the ship eventually became an incubator. What started with just a handful of cases eventually became several hundred cases. I think a quarter or a third of the people on board after a month. We fear the dormitories are actually the land-based equivalent of cruise ships. I mean, you have thousands. Some of the dormitories are really huge. There are something like 25,000 workers in them. And so we fear that by locking everybody in, even though you may start with like 2 or 3 infections, in that particular dormitory with 25,000 workers, they're now in the hundreds. You see, so they're just like cruise ships in that sense.
Yes, I do remember those cruise ships incidents well, and we are still seeing some of them play out. Alex, you mentioned before that the Singaporean government were blindsided by this surge in cases among the migrant workers. Do you think the authorities could have been better prepared in protecting them?
They certainly could, but we're not surprised. In many, many ways, the way Singapore operates is basically to ignore this 1/3 of our workforce, which are the migrant workers. We have a tendency to invisibilize them. We have a tendency to forget about them, and so it's not really common knowledge. It wasn't common knowledge until now what their living conditions were. It's probably isn't common knowledge even as we speak what ridiculous salaries they are paid, maybe a quarter or a fifth of what the average Singaporean worker would earn. So yes, there's a certain well-trained neglect from policymakers all the way down to the man in the street, and in a way, this sudden explosion of COVID-19 cases is payback time.
And Alex, I'm curious to know whether the workers have had the option of returning home, particularly with these heavier restrictions that have been put in place in recent times. Are they able to go home if they want to?
First of all, logistically it'd be difficult because all the flights are basically cancelled between Singapore and their home, or nearly all the flights are cancelled. But more importantly, though, as far as we know, just about every worker we're in touch with wouldn't want to go home. They want to be in Singapore. Firstly, because they don't want to lose their jobs. I mean, they're hoping that this is just a temporary hiatus and that before long, the lockdown will be lifted and they can return to their jobs so that they can earn money and provide for their families back home. But also, there's a certain sense that should, touch wood, they fall ill with COVID-19. Medical care in Singapore is so much better than their home countries. So if you have to fall ill, Singapore is where you should fall ill. And it's free. The Singapore government has promised that treatment for COVID-19 will be free.
Some really valid points you raised, Alex. Thanks so much for joining us on The World Tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.